Great. Okay. Okay, we're recording and can people in Zoom hear me? Can I get something in the chat? Great, awesome. All right. Sam, can you keep an eye on the chat in case there's like, just flag me if there's like something I need to do. Uh, 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 so thank you for your patience with logistics. We're doing a hybrid because some people are online and a lot of us are here. Who has used Ableton before? Like any experience, like opened Ableton before? Can you raise your hand if you've opened Ableton before? Okay. And then were you able to download it? Was anyone not able to download it? So with each step, I mean, you can just listen, but you're welcome to like put on headphones and like make music as we're doing this. I want this to be something where we're making. So the first major steps are download the software and then make sure your headphones work with it. Wired is best because there won't be a delay, but wireless headphones can work too. I'll show you the steps on that. So let's everyone open Ableton and get to this screen. See some download screens. Is it downloading? Okay. Okay. Well, I'll introduce myself while that is downloading as you're getting the setup. My name is Jason Snell. I was went to the low-res IMA 1-year program in 2023. And that if you don't, is anyone who here's did ITP or IMA? Okay. And then any like, this is like camp is your first time on the floor. Okay. Great, welcome. So ITP is the 2-year grad program, and then the IMA low res is a 1-year global intensive. So we studied here in New York, Berlin, and then Shanghai. We did our thesis work. It's a blast. And a lot of my work, my thesis work was looking at musical neural feedback. So having the brain make music and then hearing it in real time and studying how to work with psychoacoustics and sound design to bring people into essentially a hypnotic state, like a waking dream state. In general, my background, I kept saying it's like 25 years experience, but like I do the math and it's like, no, it's 2024. And so I started making music in 93. I was making VHS films in high school. I'm 47. And I need soundtracks. And so I started making just weird sounds and, for these film scores. And then I bought my first drum machine in 95 and started producing electronic music. I have done all sorts of genres. Anyone know breakcore? That's kind of a micro niche. Do we have a breakcore fan? So I was one of the early artists in the breakcore scene in like 97, 98. Made hardcore, gabber, industrial techno. Made film scores for a few years. So I was making ambient, and that led into doing film scores, particularly for horror films, which is a lot of fun because you're really turning the emotional dial on what people are supposed to feel, from the sound. And then I started getting into more experimental ways of making music. And so I built a generative music AI app about 10 years ago in 2014. And shortly after, I started working with dancers and motion sensors, where the motion is what creates the music. So I was looking at what are ways to create and compose music beyond just using traditional tools. And then in the last 5 years, I've worked with brainwaves and music. So musical neural feedback, looking at it as a type of performance, also looking at ways that could be therapeutic. If people can hear their own brains making music in real time, is that beneficial? Does anyone recognize like what these types of devices are? Can anyone name any of these? What they are, what general category, what they think they might be? Drum machine. Oh, okay. Here's a drum machine right here. It's the Roland R8 Mark II. I think it came out about 95, 96. This should be an easy one. Can you see my cursor? I made it extra big and red, which is ridiculous. I can change the color if that's helpful. This is a synthesizer. So keyboard, and it makes synth sounds. This is a 4-track, which actually uses cassette tapes, but similar to a mixer, similar to the mixer we have over here. So it's a way to control the volumes on the different sounds that are going in. This is an old school sequencer. So can you see this little green LED screen? So that's what you'd compose on. So you had like this much space. It would show like the measure and like how many bars you're copying and pasting. So for me, that's what I learned on. And so a lot of my composition skills was not using a visual interface like Ableton. So I learned a lot of composition in my head. In the beginning, I would just draw out my songs on paper and then essentially program them with a sequencer. And then these two rack mounts, this is a sampler. It's an Akai SO1, and it had a sample time of, anyone guess what the max sample time was on this early Akai sampler? We think would be a criminally low amount of time per song for samples. 4 seconds, that's a good guess. It was 24 seconds. So 24 seconds per floppy disk. And so that's why I started producing on. So I learned how to layer samples, and you can do things where you sample it pitched up. So it's a short sample and then pitch it down in the sampler. So you have more use of that 24 seconds. And then layering them like different octaves. And so they all sound in the same key at different octaves, and they create these atmospheres. But you're still using the same sample. And it was kind of grainy because it was an older machine. And then when you sample things high and pitch them down, it can get a little grainy and lo-fi. And then this one is a digital synthesizer. It's really hard to see, but it's a JB880. So the reason I point out all these things is Ableton does all of this. And so all these different, you used to need to have a full studio with all these pieces of gear, and then Ableton, which you download for free, get to use for 30 days. You can do all these things within Ableton. Any questions so far about, okay, online, people doing good? I'll take your silence as a yes. Okay, does everyone have Ableton open? Oh, yes, the question. Definitely. So you can use hardware with Ableton, so you can plug in MIDI controllers via USB. And it depends on the type of music you want to make. But a lot of times I make electronic or music that's meant for dance in some sort of way, regardless of tempo. It can be fast or slow. And so if I'm using my mouse, it's not music that's as corporal or body oriented. It's kind of more mathy, heady, like mouse clicky, is probably the best way to describe. And you can see as different tools come out over the years, how genres change and how styles change. And so when laptops, became a primary way of making music and using mouse pads, there was a period where music got, like in the 2000s, very kind of like mathy and more like, not as body oriented. And so for me, I like using physical like drum machines and drum pads if I'm making rhythms. Playing keys on a keyboard is going to be much more expressive than, we'll use the keyboard on this, but it's only one octave at a time. So having a in my studio, I have a full keyboard where I can, and it just makes like different tools lead to different genres. And so, having something that is more physical lends itself to more physical music. Now, if you're doing something like a film score or classical, the computer might be fine, but it's, I see a comment mentioning the Novation Launchpad. So there are MIDI controllers you can use, and also like knob turns. You can automate things in Ableton, almost like drawing in a timeline, like a film editing software. But if I'm using knobs and jamming with a track, it's much more, there's a better groove for me. That's a great question, though. The question was, can you restate the question so I can say it for the people?
Yeah.
Yes. Do I find myself resorting backwards to some of the equipment rather than just using Ableton? And I do. I'm assuming, are we still installing? Does anyone, I'll phrase it this way. Does anyone want me to pause while you install it? Speak now, or otherwise I'll move forward. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else need headphones from the ER? All right. I didn't catch the question. Should the headphones be wider? If it is wired, there's going to be no latency, but wireless will work. Yeah. And for today's purposes, wireless is fine. All right, let's jump into Ableton. So this is the startup screen. And can you see this cursor? You can see my big, ridiculous cursor. Okay. I might even make it bigger. So this is a library. And you can browse, there's samples, there's instruments, there's effects. And so we'll go through some of these libraries and how to grab assets from these libraries and bring it into a song composition. First thing we'll do, let's go down to samples. And if you don't see this library, you can toggle by clicking open this arrow in case it's closed. And so in samples, these are included in Ableton, and they're just loops or sound samples that you can use. And it's an easy way to get started. You drag it over into this area here, which we'll do in a second. And I think for starting with Ableton, it's easy to start with loops because it will be more musical and it'll feel like you're making a groove faster. So what I did in this top bar is I just typed loop. You can also type BPM and you'll get a bunch of loops at different BPMs.
Right.
Yep. I have a little bit of a Midwest accent. Roof and egg. I guess I say all those with some sort of accent. Okay, so let's do loop. I'm going to grab an acid techno beat loop. I'm going to drag it over to an audio track. Now, I'm going to skip over these MIDI tracks. We're not going to work with those quite yet. We're going to start just with audio. So I'm going to drag it to the top slot in this audio 3 track. Everyone got that? And let's see how the volume is on this. So I'm going to hit play on this. Okay. So it's a pre-made loop, and it's just a very quick way to get started. Someone asks the Ableton open with an existing track. How do you get rid of it? You can go to File, New Live Set if you want to start from scratch. And then when I play this music, do the people on Zoom hear me or hear the music? I did share sound. I just want to make sure that you can hear it through the application. Great, thank you. Thanks, Meredith. So if you double click into the clip that we dragged over, we're going to see the beat. So this is a visual representation of the audio file. And it's stereo, so that's why you see it twice. The top half is left, the bottom half is right. And you can see where the beats are, and you can see, particularly as we play it, you'll see the playhead move through. So you can see the claps and the hi-hats. And then something that happens right when you, something that, I want to lean into the computer a little bit. Something that happens right when you load something, there's this button over here called Warp. And this is pretty much the main technology of Ableton. This is why Ableton got popular when they first made it. So Warp is a type of time stretching. So normally when you have a sample and you want to make it longer or shorter, you can pitch it, but that changes the tone of it. You know, it sounds sped up or it sounds slowed down. And this Warp technology, it's also called time stretch. And that was a technology that came out in samplers, like that Akai sampler that I showed you. Time stretch was a way to change the time of a sample without messing with the pitch. And that's what Ableton does. Because Ableton was originally made to perform electronic music. And they thought, well, if I've got a loop that's 100 BPM and another one that's 110, another one that's like 105, how do I make sure that they all stay in sync without me like tweaking each of those? And so I've got this up here. Do you see this tempo here? This is the main tempo. And it probably reset based on the loop you dragged in. But what I'm doing is I'm clicking and dragging up and down, and that's changing the tempo. And if my loops are warped, they will change tempo, even though it's not a MIDI file, it's an audio file. It'll change tempo with the track. So let's try that. So 120 sounds normal, like the original tempo. And so I'm clicking right here and I'm just dragging down. Get down to like really undanceable. It's like 25 BPM. And you can hear the algorithm trying to, because we're stretching out the data information so much that you can hear it, you know, it's taking whatever limited information it has and it's trying to interpolate the gaps as it's being stretched apart. But that can end up being an interesting effect. So you have this like low, weird, rumbly bass. And the clap, it's like, instead of. And then some of the work I've done with looking at biology in music is that dance music essentially is in the same BPM range as our heart. And so, you know, super athlete might have a tempo around 40 BPM, 45. And you can kind of pick up on I mean, it's slow dancing, but there's kind of a groove at 40. And then in terms of, if you go slower, it almost sounds like experimental or ambient. It's not really like a groove anymore because it's so much slower. And then on the other side, you know, when I first started making music in the mid-90s, I was up around 200 BPM. And so, you know, you can still dance to it, not for long, but, you know, it is danceable. But if you get much higher, there's a certain point where it gets above what the heart can do, the physical human heart. So you start getting more of like a drone, you know, it's like tones. It's where rhythm becomes a pitch, and it's certainly not danceable. I have played speedcore tracks like at 580 BPM, and I can tell you 100% they are not danceable. Like dance floors do not like them. Yes, please. It is faster. What is that? I would the bottom of it, the standard. So normally like 120 is a really danceable beat because that's a heart that's like excited, and physically dancing to 120 is quite doable. A big shift culturally happened in electronic music during the pandemic, and I think a lot of younger people discovered it as they spent essentially a year at home, producing things like Ableton, DJing, and when you're younger, you just like faster tempos. You just have more energy. Whereas the techno and the rave scene was getting a bit, like myself, getting a bit older, and we're like, 120 is good. Like I don't want to like push myself too much on the dance floor. And so this like surge of new tempos, I would say 135 would be considered very slow. So it's more like 140, 150, 160. And it's getting into these like very fast techno, kind of like slow hardcore speeds. But yeah, I am running into that in New York and in Berlin. Yes.
So for BPM, setting up there and one on the bottom, what's the difference?
Let me move my. Here. So this is the BPM of the sample. And so when you dragged it in, it's Ableton's guess of what the BPM is. So let's say you made something in another program and it's 100, and you dragged it into here, and Ableton's like, oh, I think it's 140. You can manually correct it. And so that's what it will use as the BPM it thinks it is. So we're back down at a normal tempo. I'm going to drag another clip. Let's find so you can preview by just clicking here. That's full of gloom. What do you think of that? Shiva, give me a yes or no on that. Maybe a flute solo? Flute? All right. So I'm going to do a flute. So I'm dragging a flute to a different audio track because it's going to be a different sound source. I want them to play at the same time. So it's going to have its own vertical track. I don't know if a flute is going to work with this acid techno. I might want something houseier. Well, actually, this might work. Let's try this. So I'm going to hit play on both of these. So I'm going to hit play on this first. And you'll see when I click play on the flute loop, it won't start right away. It will wait for the next loop. And so that's the other thing that Ableton does, is it keeps things quantized for you. Again, because originally it was a performance technology. And so if I'm bringing a new beat, I don't want to accidentally come in halfway through a 4 or an 8 loop. I want to come in at the beginning where it sounds like it's a new part of the song. So I'll play this a few times, and then we'll hear the flute come in and see how it sounds. Then I want to come in at the end of this. So you see, they're in a groove together. They're within the same loop. So they're not like drifting, they're in the same groove. And you'll see what I did is the flute was a little loud for me. And so what I'm doing is I'm clicking and dragging this black arrow on the volume meter. And that's a way that you can control the volume of each track. So just one the loop, I could make the beat quieter. Does everyone follow that so far in terms of this is and then let's say I didn't put it on its own track. Let's say I put it underneath. So this is just some basic interface items. So if I put it and I'm playing this, and then I click this and I'm like, well, I want the flute to come in on top of the techno. You can hear the techno stops because it's on the same audio track. So you can put different sounds on the same audio track and go through them. And that's how people create like different music sets. And so each horizontal layer can be like the next step in your song or the next step in your DJ set or musical performance set. But in order for things to play simultaneously, they need their own vertical track. And those tracks, these vertical columns are the same as these sliders on this mixer. So they each have their own slider. Each one is its own dedicated track. Any questions so far? So combine two really amazing samples. Yes, please. Yeah, let's take a look at that. So the question was, why is the music not coming into the headphones? So to make sure your headphones work, go up to Live and then down to Settings. And then there's this Audio tab. So it's the second one down. And then for your output device, it might be on your Mac speakers. And so I've got like 15 audio devices. So I'm choosing external headphones. Yep. Does that make sense to everyone? How to get your headphones working? Okay, so we've got two loops playing. The next thing I want to look at. So you can go through, excuse me, you can go through the browser and it's got all these different types of samples. You can do searches, but you can also drag in your own samples from your computer. And so one of the things I did, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new audio track because I like this techno beat. I think the flute's great. Thank you, Shiva. And I'm going to go to create and insert audio track. And a question online from Brian is warp what's creating the sync between the two sounds? And the answer is yes. So it's warping it to match tempos. Oh, we can do this experiment quick. So I'm going to hit play on both of these. If you want to play both tracks at once, you can hit this play button far on the right, and it will play everything in that horizontal row. So if I change the tempo on this, the loop and the beat will stay in sync. So it's stretching out that loop sound the best it can. And you can hear the interpolation as it's like. Really well sounds. And if I speed it up, I won't go as fast this time, but you know. Can you sing it? You could, yeah. The way you do that would be to turn warp off. And so they wouldn't be in sync via Ableton anymore. And I think you need warp on in order to loop, but you can, and Ableton's biggest feature is to do all that work for you, to keep it in sync. Something you could do, you can change the length of things. And so I'm going to, I double click the flute loop, and it's quite hard to see, but see these little yellow rectangles? They're warp markers. And so something you can do is you can add new ones by double clicking, and you can force the sample to kind of stretch and be different in weird ways. So that's a part of warp. So I'm going to go back to a normal tempo, and we'll hear it's the same flute solo, but parts are faster and parts are slower. Alice, did you get lost? Okay. And so I just double clicked up here and I'm dragging these yellow markers back and forth. So let's give this a listen. So slow down the beginning, and all the notes at the end are crunched together. Or I could do it the other way. I can speed up the beginning. So essentially, I'm taking the audio sample and squishing parts of it and stretching other parts. And that's what you could do with these warp markers. So you can just leave it as is, and it'll keep its original time, but you can manipulate the beat. Let's try it on the actual beat as well. It'll be much more pronounced. So it played a bunch of beats and then it's like stretching it out. And so what was a 4/4 dance speed has a totally different vibe now. And then you can remove those markers just by double clicking it, and it'll revert back to the original mapping. Does that make sense? Those warp markers. Yes, please. It's only playing once for you. Do you see this little window over here on the left side? Is warp on? And then is loop on? So there's this loop yellow button. It might be grayed out. Did that work? Yep. So the question was, he was playing a sample and it was playing through once, but wasn't looping. Sometimes this loop button gets turned off when you drag something in. So we have samples that I've grabbed from the Ableton library. I want to show you creating a sample or pulling a sample from your desktop. So just to show you what I did again, I went to create, insert audio track. And then I've got a full sample of, do you know jungle, early drum and bass as a genre? Or not? Does people know drum and bass? Do you know the term jungle? It was like an earlier version of drum and bass. A little bit of music history. Jungle was based on these samples here. So they are like funk, jazz, rhythm and blues, drum samples. What's that? Hello. I have no idea why that happened. Sorry for the folks at home. Anyway, so it's based on these drum samples. And the move from jungle to drum and bass is that a lot of the rhythms in these sampled drummer samples were then created on drum machines. And so a lot of the nuance and the groove was somewhat taken out and made a little more mechanical, and that became drum and bass. And there was also a shift in terms of racial culture where the drummers on these loops were mostly Black, and then moved over to UK, a lot of some Black producers, but a lot of white producers as well. And so it was like taking this original sample material, stripping out the original samples and figuring out how do I make this beat just with a drum machine. But the original samples are fantastic. Yeah. When was Jungle founded? A lot of it did come from UK. A lot of it came from using these samples as the Kai samplers got more powerful. So I'd have to look up exact dates, but I'm assuming, I mean, sometimes like a technology comes out and then it isn't used for a few years. It takes a while for an artist to find it and make it popular. But I'm guessing early to mid 90s. First time I heard Jungle was 95 in Chicago. But a lot of the records were coming out of UK. And sampling, drummers from, a lot of them are US drummers. And because it's sample based, first time I heard it, I had no idea how it was made. It was like so complex and amazing. And that's something that we'll hear as we grab some of these. Did that answer the question? The question for people on Zoom was, when did Jungle start? And a lot of these new genres come up when a new technology comes up. So that's important of, if you're interested in building new technologies, as you make a new technology, it may lead to new art forms or new genres. Because you couldn't have jungle without really robust samplers. Let's try this one, Fool's Gold. And for people at home, I sent out an email that links to these samples. I think they're called drum rhythm samples on Google Drive. Yeah.
Follow up. What do you mean by robust?
Oh, sure. More robust samplers with longer sample time, being able to layer more layers, higher fidelity, better control, being able to send MIDI to it and being able to have one of those old sequencers be able to control it. Digital sampling, I think I would say is a big part of it, because prior, when you're doing sampling, you were essentially working with tape reels. And so to move over to digital, where you could trigger something and chop it up and change the start point, that's where those were the technological advances that had to happen in order for jungle to happen. Yeah. All right, let's listen to Fool's Gold. So all of a sudden the beat has way more groove. If we listen just to the original beat, just a pretty basic like 4/4 beat. And this is the drummer sample, Fool's Gold. They're really good grooves. Yeah, they're all break beats. And then you can also layer them. So I'm going to do create, insert another audio track. And let's try Funky Drummer. And because Ableton figures out the tempo, and it's all being mapped to the main tempo of the track, these samples, which are not the same length, will work together. So let's listen. Oh, it's muted, sorry. So these are two different drummers, but because of Ableton Warp, these two drum samples work together. This is just Funky Drummer. And this is just Fool's Gold. Totally different guys, different drummers, different recording sessions, but they work together. And so it can be super powerful to mix live recording. So if, is anyone here like a traditional musician, like play instruments? Yep. So you can get that organic feel, you can do a live session, record a loop, and then mix it with electronic sounds. And it works really well, where you have a more organic rhythm from a physical instrument.
Now that you're mentioning
Yeah, totally. So I'd have to research it, but from what I remember, when sampling started coming up, the basic idea was that you can sample something if it's under a certain amount of time. Because without the sampler, not just jungle, but hip hop wouldn't exist, because hip hop uses so many samples from that same era of rhythm and blues, jazz, soul. And so how much can you sample before you have to be like, oh, I'm just like taking too much of this person's track? What I would see happen as musicians would get to bigger and bigger labels is you start to see them cite the samples. So like in the liner notes, you'd say this track samples such and such a track. And so that's like the proper way to do it. In general, you don't get sued if you're poor. And so if you're just like making tracks in your bedroom and like just using samples, you're fine. But if you find something that's like you make something that's a big hit, that's where the issues come of did you license it? Can you replace it with something else, etc. For people on Zoom, the question was, what's the legality of using samples? So I would have to look up the exact time, but it's a certain amount of seconds. Another question about warping is there some sort of music theory behind warping? Just curious. I think it's more of a mathematical algorithm of looking at, so a sample is a bunch of audio information, it's a ton of information. So that's why audio files are so much bigger than like an HTML or a text file, because it's a huge amount of slices, and those slices play the data, and those slices play fast enough that it sounds continuous to us. And what warping does is it pulls those slices apart, and then it looks at the data between the slices and figures out what the information is between them. It's called interpolation. I've been using that term. And the more you stretch it out, the more the algorithm is kind of churning and working to try to figure out what is the sound between these two samples. hopefully, Brian, that answered your question. So we've used Ableton samples inside of Ableton. We've pulled in samples from the desktop. Any questions before I move on to MIDI? Does anyone know what MIDI is? Have you heard of MIDI? Let's go to the MIDI. Let's get to the MIDI slide. So it's so it's MIDI. So it's I've seen some confused faces like, what the hell is MIDI? MIDI is an old computer language. I wouldn't call it a programming language, but it's a computer language, and it's musical instrument digital interface. And it allows computers to talk to drum machines, to talk to keyboards, etc. And essentially, the best way I could explain it is that MIDI is like sending sheet music between the computer and either other computers, but MIDI itself doesn't have audio information. It's just the notes. It's just the sheet music. There's also something in MIDI that it's called the MIDI control change, or you'll see it as CC. It's also called continuous controller, but a MIDI CC is the same as a knob turn on a synthesizer. So let's say you have a frequency knob that's like, you could program where you don't have to physically turn the synthesizer knob to do that. You could program a sequencer to turn that knob for you by going up and down. So it's just information, it's not audio. So it's like sheet music and knob turns. So we've got these MIDI tracks. And again, the best way to think about these is sheet music. In the library on our left side, some of it is samples, but a number of these things are MIDI instruments. So they're instruments that need sheet music to play. So for example, I'm going to go to instruments. There's a bunch of categories here. And I'll start with one of the Ableton's built-in synthesizers. It's called Analog, and it's emulating old vintage analog synthesizers. And these black arrows that you open and close, you can see different categories. It's all the same synthesizer, but the knobs are just turned in different ways to sound like different instruments. So you can customize the synthesizer to sound like strings, to sound like a bass sound, to sound like acid, to sound like a drum. And so I'm going to go into the bass sounds. So what I've done is just open and close these black arrows. So I've opened up analog, now I'm opening up bass. And if I single click on these, I'll get a little preview sound. If you don't hear the preview, make sure this little, looks like a headphones icon is blue. So if I click this, so it's a bass sound. Let's try a rhythmic octave bass. Fat leather bass. Ooh, I like that. Okay. So, yes, please. So there's a question about finding the analog synthesizer. So in the categories on the side are you in instruments? And then you go up to analog and open up the arrow. And you don't have these categories. Which version of Ableton do you have? Do you have? I have the suite, which I realized the free one. Seeing the same thing. Can you? What instruments do you have? Did you say it was called Badass Lead?
Yeah.
Let me look for that. Is badass one word or two words? Okay. Okay, let's do fat leather. You can also search in the top. So I'm going to do fat leather bass. So I've single clicked it to preview that off. In order to bring it into my Ableton project, just like an audio sample, I'm going to drag it over to its own track. But instead of it being an audio track, it's a MIDI track. So if you see how the cursor changed when I tried to drag it onto one of these audio tracks, I get that no sign. So it only works on the MIDI tracks. So I'm going to click and drag it, and I'm going to let go of it on MIDI 1. So this is now a MIDI track. And when you first load something in, it will automatically, they call it ARM, which I think is too violent of a term, but it's set for recording. So this red button automatically turns on, meaning that it's ready to record. And instead of this play symbol, we've got this circle symbol, which means it's ready to record. And then the other thing I'll show you, so there's no like play button because this synthesizer that we loaded in, there's no sheet music yet. And so without sheet music, it doesn't know what to play. And so that's why it looks different than this. So when we drag the sample and the audio samples, we have this play button, the volume, everything looks a certain way. But with MIDI, it's waiting for some sort of note information. Do I play a C? Do I play a D sharp? How long do I play it? So Ableton needs to know that in order to know how to play this fat leather, is it bass? Fat leather bass. Yes.
I think the two different file types in instruments, ADG and ADV, with a slightly different.
Let me find so whoops. So the question was, it was ADG and what was the other file type? ADV. Let me find an ADV file and look at it.
Yeah, some of them will have.
I do. So the question was, what's the difference between ADG and ADV? Yep. So I don't know the exact term of what the V means. A is Ableton, D is device. So V, maybe it means virtual instrument, but ADV means it's a single module, and ADG, G means group. And so my fat leather bass here is an ADG. This is a group, and you can see the components of the group by opening this. It's almost like a folder icon, and it's several things stacked together, and there's a macro on top of it. So the person who created this ADG found the most fun things to tweak and have them as these 8 macros. So that's an ADG. So it's something that's grouped together with macros. That's a great question. All right, so let's go back to fat leather bass, which is an ADG. And I'm arming it by clicking the red record button at the bottom. So there's 2 things I can do now that's armed. I could double click into this and manually draw out the sheet music. I'll show you that first. So this top row, same row as my samples over here, I'm going to double click the top bar. So when I double clicked it, the view changed on the bottom. I'm going to drag this up so I can see. And this is where my sheet music goes. And I can just double click and add notes. And it starts with one loop, one measure loop. And then perfect timing, I see a question in the chat. How do you mute a channel if you want to test playing just with that channel? Which I'm going to do so we don't hear fat leather bass with all of our samples. So to mute and unmute tracks, you can hit the button with the number on it, the track number. If it's yellow, it's unmuted, and you can mute them by turning them off to the gray state. The other thing you can do, which is a kind of a quick thing, is you can solo a track by hitting the S button. And that means you're only going to hear the track with the S button, and all the others get grayed out and muted. Either one works. So I'm going to solo my fat leather bass. I've double clicked into my sheet music. And so we've got some, it's a down note, up, down, up, down. See how it sounds. I have no idea how this is going to sound. It's kind of basic. So let's say, like all the notes are the same length because when I double clicked it to it, and they're quantizing to the grid. So you see how the cursor changes when I move to the note? I can make the notes longer or shorter. All right, so let's make this one longer too. All right, and let's try, and then you can move them up and down as well. If it's a little hard to grab them, which it is with my huge red cursor, if you move to this left side and drag left and right, you can zoom in on your sheet music. Makes it a little easier to move up and down. So I can drag these around, make them off the grid. The other thing you can do, I've clicked into this space and I'm going to do Command A for select all. So it's selected all the notes. And if I hold Shift and up arrow or down arrow, I can shift it everything up an octave or down an octave. So it'll go exactly up 12 semitones or down. So I'm going to try pitching it down. So I'm going to hit arrow down, hit play, down again. And let's try going up. So that's the sheet music, so this is a great example of I composed this lovely little tune with my mouse pad. It isn't really pumping. Like it's not like a really good jam. It's like this, it sounds like computer music. And it sounds like computer music because I made it with a computer mouse pad. So that's the point of, now if I had a keyboard and I was playing, I might be able to find sounds that are more expressive and fun because I'm physically using my hands. Shit is dying. All right, so let's do that. Yes. Change the instrument? That's a great idea. So I can keep those same notes and let's try a piano sound. So I'm going to the browser on the left and let's do ePiano. I'm going to drag it to a different MIDI track and I can copy and paste the sheet music. So the sheet music that's in fat leather bass, I can copy, Control C, and over here and do Control V. And let's see how those same notes sound as piano. So it's prettier, it's not as abrasive as our fat leather bass. So this is both of the instruments playing at the same time, same sheet music, because they each have a copy of the sheet music. Kind of a side tip, not super important, but you can, I think, Control click or Command R. You can rename it, so it can be like my sheet music or my amazing loop. So it's easier to keep track of things. Yes, Kate. So to make another MIDI track, you go up to Create, Insert MIDI track. So this is also a really good point on, which are these the same. So I've got my amazing loop, which is my MIDI music, playing different instruments. So it shows that MIDI itself isn't audio, it's just sheet music. And so I can point that sheet music towards a piano, towards a bass, towards a string sound, and it's the same sheet music. That's the separation between MIDI and audio. MIDI is just the sheet music. So let's say my amazing loop isn't so amazing. And I'm going to arm the leather bass again. So see my big red cursor in the upper right corner? I think by default this is off, but do you see this little keyboard? Not the thing that says key, but it's this little keyboard icon. So if I turn this on, make sure it's yellow, I can then use my computer keyboard as a keyboard for whatever track that is armed. So it's keys A, it's the middle row. So it's A, S, D, F, G, H, J, K, L, I think semicolon. No, just up to L. So I'm going to physically play a sound on my keyboard instead of type in the sheet music. So a little bit more of a jam. I'm not saying it's amazing. I'm more of a rhythm guy myself. And then you can move up and down an octave by pressing Z or X. Let's try going down an octave. So I'm playing physically with the keyboard. It sounds much different. It's less like computer music and it sounds more like people music. Now, I want to hear this with my beat because it's, you know, if I'm going to make a bass line, I want that bass line to sound good with the beat. So I'm going to unsolo these. I'm going to hit any of these stop buttons because I don't want to hear my amazing loop. So I'm going to hit these stop buttons so they're not playing. And I just want to hear all my drums. So I'm going to turn solo off. Everything is yellow. And high pressure. Let's see if I can make a good bass line for everyone. There's our beat. This is armed, my lovely bass. Okay, I like that. So how do I record it? So I'm going to go, so you can have a bunch of different sheet music on the same instrument. So I've got my computer, I'm going to name that computer music. So it's clear, computer music. And so I'm going to go to the second one. Again, this track is armed. It's red on the bottom. And so this circle here is, I'm going to hit that and I'm going to be able to record in real time. And what I'm going to do is I don't have to record it perfectly the first time. I can wait and then like trim it. So I'm going to like mess up a few times and wait until I feel like I did a good loop and then grab it. So you'll hear me play it a few times. Hope I can remember what I did. Nope. Great. Okay, so I played it a few times, and what I'm going to do is, you see the sheet music was being made in real time. So as I was playing the keyboard, it was writing the sheet music. And it's a much faster way, it's much more human, expressive way to create music in Ableton. And so I played it for several, how many loops? Looks like 8 measures. And it didn't really get good, I would say, until about 5 to 7. So I'm going to shrink, I'm going to grab the loop handle and pull it in to 5. And then grab the end, pull it into 7. And I'm just going to see how that sounds. So I'm going to hit play. And the one I just recorded, it named it based on the track. And it should play when I hit spacebar. I don't think that's bad. Any questions about what I just did? Yes, please. Or anything. What was the what for live recording? The button? Yeah, I'll show you. So I go to an empty bar and I hit the little circle. And so I could write another one. So I'm going to go down an octave. And so I've got 2 sheet musics for the same track. So I can alternate in the course of the track. and then go down to the next one. And then I can go back to the first baseline. So I can create variations with the same instrument with these different sheet music blocks. Any questions on that? If I wanted both to play, I would create a new MIDI track with the same instrument and they could play together. But again, each vertical column is its own slider and audio source. So I could do that by doing duplicate. Yeah.
Can you show the state you have it in when you sort of play?
Mhm.
You have that platform.
Definitely. So the question was, let's see the state and when I was recording. So the track is armed, which is the red button down here. And you can see when I turn the red button off, it's kind of subtle, but these circles turn to squares. So it's right now they're squares and now they're circles. And so they're circles, meaning they're ready for recording. And then I go to the next empty one. And when I hit this circle, everything will start playing. And then in the bottom is the live. Spacebar. Yeah, I've been hitting a spacebar for start stop without letting anyone know. I apologize. I also could hit the play button up here, but spacebar is an easy way if I'm playing the keyboard.
What's the record button on top? Is that helpful at all?
It is, but that's in a view that we'll cover later in the session. So right now we're in clip view, which is mostly about creating loops and getting the song together. And then in the last bit, we'll switch over to what's called session view. So if you've ever used like GarageBand or Logic, it's more that view. So I'll show it to you briefly and then forget it but I'm going to hit tab. That's the timeline session view. And I hit tab to go back to. So that's one of the more confusing things about Ableton is it has these two very distinct views and you can make music in different ways depending on what view you're in. Since this is intro to Ableton, I'm focusing just on this view first. But this record button is good for the timeline view, the session view. Great question. Any other questions on MIDI?
For the way I think the steps for it's not getting my. Do I have to activate something?
Yeah, so your keyboard's not working? Yeah, make sure this icon in the upper right is yellow. And then, so it's not just synthesizers with MIDI. You know, like I mentioned, I started with drum machines. And so one of the things I really enjoy is making my own rhythms. And so I like the samples I'm using and I want to accentuate it. And we're not using the piano, so I'm going to delete the piano. And okay, so I'm going to create a new MIDI track. So I'm going to go to create, insert MIDI track. And in instruments, I want to look at drums. And what would be, let me think. Yeah, so if you go to categories drums, there's all these different drum kits. And are people familiar with the Roland XOX series? So that just means 808, 909, 707. Seen some nod, some not. So Roland made what ended up being a really famous series of drum machines and synthesizers in the 80s. And if you've ever heard dance music ever, you've heard of one of these Roland machines. So the 909 has a really sharp, good techno hit. With hip hop, when you have that low, long bass, that's an 808 kick. So it's like, that's an 808. Do you know acid music, like acid house or acid techno? that's based on a synthesizer, which sounds kind of similar to this fat leather bass. It's called a 303, a Roland 303, and it's like a so it's this very acidy sound. And yes, I'm happy to imitate any instrument. So let's I'm gonna grab the 808 kick because I like the low bass and 808 kicks. So I'm gonna take this 808 kick, and it needs sheet music. It's a MIDI instrument, so I'm gonna drag onto the MIDI channel. And then when I double click the sheet music on this, and I'm gonna raise the bar up, you can see each note has its own label, its own instrument label. So instead of saying I'm a C or I'm a D sharp or I'm an E or I'm an F, it's got all these different sounds. And when I play my keyboard now, let's see, octave if I may. So I'm playing my keyboard, and the reason it was silent, I have to move around. I have to find the right octave where these sounds are. So I hit Z and X a few times to kind of bounce around. So I'm playing my keyboard. And so when I put in sheet music, it's going to insert drum sounds rather than like piano sounds. So if I do a drum kick, I'm going to solo this. Do you hear just that kick? It's a little quiet. It's very quiet. So I'm going to go to the kit, and it has this macro. So I'm going to see, so I've selected my bass drum. I'm going to increase the drive amount. I'm not hearing a change. Let's try the gain. There we go. So by turning these knobs, I can change the characteristics of the sound. And then I can create my own beat. So I'm going to do, on the snare, I'm going to put on the 1.2 and the 3.2. So I can drag the notes around so it sounds, like a breakbeat, but if it's off, nothing wrong with that, but you can kind of mess with what creates a good rhythm or what creates an off rhythm by clicking and dragging these sounds. And I'm going to put a hi-hat on a bunch of them. So let's find a closed hi-hat. Yeah, grimy. Yeah, okay. I'm liking this. That symbol. So these different knobs are different effects and compressors that were made by the sound designer. So I'm shortening the decay on the, I can change the tone of it. So I'm going to bring in one of my drum samples, see how that sounds. Turn it up a little bit. Okay, I'm into that. I don't know how my that leather bass is gonna sound. Let's try this. And the flute. Remember the flute? Okay. Okay. So MIDI can also be used to trigger drums. That's the point of that. Yes, please. That's a great question. So, the question for the Zoom folks was that when musicians or DJs are performing live with Ableton, are they making it in real time, kind of like what I'm doing right here, or is everything kind of preset? And it's a spectrum. So on one end, not even using Ableton, you have live coding, where people are coding and that's inserting the notes and you can see them making it in real time, all the way to where each each horizontal thing is super like laid out. Each one sounds good and they can go from one to the next to the next. Or you can have controllers, MIDI controllers, where you can jump from different beat loops to beat loops and play different samples. And you're like, oh, now the flute would sound good. And you hit that. And so you can program a hardware controller to, it's called launching or playing different clips. So let's say this whole area was just filled with cool clips and they all sound essentially good together. I can play those live by hitting this and this and this, or I could use my mouse and click play, on different ones. Yeah. Let's see. It's 12:45. Do you want to take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back and dive into effects? So we'll look at delay, reverb, distortion, and the psychoacoustics of those effects. Like, why do those effects have a certain impact on listeners' brains? Sound good? All right, I'll see you in 10 minutes.
I thought yeah, that's right.
So it's only next session. This will be March. Okay, got it. No. Thank you.
Oh, is that what you're?
Yeah, they are. I'm like, Yeah, my break.
All right, we're gonna get started again. I'm gonna wash waffles off my fingers. I'll be back.
Oh, but, sure. So obvious. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Let's meander back to our computers. So where we last left our hero was MIDI samples, 808 chord kit. I want to show you effects, but I'm going to show you one more of my favorite MIDI instruments. It's just a single kick, and it's much more customizable. Sure. Sure. Yeah, let's so the question is, can I share this file? So I'm going to save live set. For ITP camp demo. And that's a great question. So the question is, do the samples export? The answer would be some. So the ones that are in the Ableton library already, you're fine, but the ones I dragged in aren't. So in order to save your file with all the samples, you do something that's called collect all and save. And that will include the drum and bass samples that I dragged in. So I'm doing collect all and save. Okay, and then go to downloads. I'm gonna zip it up. Press. And should be pretty small. So it's 839 kilobytes, and I'll email it to everyone. There's Slack. I was like, panic. There's a Telegram channel. I think I've got a sent thing that I sent out earlier.
Yeah.
And I can hit reply all. Yes. File. And I'm going to attach ITP camp. So I'm sending everyone the zip file. And let me know if you get that. Kate, did that come through? See how the beat sounds. Great. So I want to show you one other MIDI instrument, and then we'll get into effects. So I'm going to go to create. insert MIDI track. And I'm gonna go over to instruments and the navigation on the left. And it's called a drum synth. And it's a newer instrument from Ableton. I love these. Something I don't like about the drum racks is that it brings in a whole kit and you might just use like 2 of the sounds or whatever. And the drum synths are really customizable. They're really high quality. It's a really good sound. And the one I use a lot is the kick, because kicks are the foundation of all dance music, but most of the music I work with. So I'm going to drag the kick, it's called the DS kick, over to MIDI. When I first drag it over to a new track, it automatically arms it. And I've got my keyboard selected up here, the yellow keyboard. So I'm hitting my keyboard. Turn up a little bit. It's just a good, robust kick. And then what I can do is I can really customize it. I can actually click this as well, or I can hit anything on my keyboard. So we've got the pitch. So there's certain times if I want it, it's like I want my kick to be an A, or I want my kick to be a C, or I want my kick to be 65 Hertz. I can do that exactly. I can change the decay. So the decay is how long it takes to tail off. So I can make it sound like one of those big 808 sounds. Or a real short. And lower. Kind of the bounce of it is an envelope. So if it's really flat, envelope is down, then more of a kind of a curve in the envelope that it's got good distortion on it. Like that's a good hardcore like gabber beat. Or totally smooth. You can make it softer. So by trimming the attack of the sound is how fast and hard the sound comes in. So if you increase the attack, it slides in smoother. So this is the attack is at 0, so it hits very definitively. But as I increase the attack, it's smoothing in and it starts to feel more underwater or like a heartbeat. That's by changing the attack. So what I'm doing is I'm clicking into the attack and just dragging up or down. I do a lot of soundscapes with heartbeat type sounds, and so I increase the attack. Anyways, so each one of these, there's a snare. You can just really customize. Ton of evidence. Yeah, they're really compact, high quality. They're great. And then when you play, when you add keys to it, you're just adding notes to that one drum. So it's kind of a simpler way to organize things. I'll add like I'll turn it back to a kick. I'm gonna get rid of the kick on this one because it's not strong. So I'm gonna double click that note to get rid of the bass drum. And this is our DS kick. I'm just gonna add one long note. And bring the kick down. Make it a little longer. More distorted. So one last thing before we get into effects. Depending on if you have Ableton 11 or 12, there's this, in Ableton 12, it's main track, and Ableton 11, they call it master track. When you see all the sounds playing, this is turning red. Do you see that? And, you know, I came from a culture of like hardcore and analog gear and DJing on equipment and pushing it to its brink. And so like red meant go, like red is good, you know, because you get this like nice compression and gain and this like fuzzy feeling to something that is normally crisp, and you get this more rounded, like distorted feel. With digital, it's totally different. When you get red, the digital clipping is just really obnoxious. And so to avoid that, what I generally do is knock off the numbers that you see. So from 60 up to 0, and then it goes above it a little bit. Those are decibels. And for reasons I won't get into and today, 0 decibel is like essentially full volume. You can go above it, but 0 is like your baseline. And then you go into negative as you get closer to silence. So I'm going to knock 6 dB, or I'm just going to drag each of these down a little bit. I'm going to drag each one. And the ideal is that the relationship between all the tracks stays the same. And we're not clipping in the red. There we go. So it's green, it's getting close to 0. Green is happy. In the long run, when you export, you won't get these weird like clips and unintended distortion. Any questions before I get into effects? Let's check Zoom. Everyone good on Zoom? Is anyone on Zoom? No, we've got some participants. All good, great. Thanks, Ryan. Say again. Why can't I drag the master track? Is that what you said? Oh, I see. Just lower it here. It is a quick fix and that will kind of work. But as you get into more and more complex, you want to, it's, if you've ever done like a video or photo shooting, the earlier in a process that you can fix something, the better. So the idea of like, oh, just fix it in post never works out. It always takes like 10 times longer to like fix something in post, whereas like just, you know, get the lighting good or like the sound good or whatever as early as possible. So it's that basic principle is to get a really good clean level that's not too hot and not too low on the original tracks. It makes mixing and mastering on the master track much easier. That's why I do it. That's a great question though. The question was, why not just drag down the master track volume if it's in the red? Okay, let's get into effects. What would be a good one? Maybe the leather bass. So we'll jump over to the slides for a second. I'm gonna make CCs. I always make these slides and then I just like go through it in Ableton. Effects. Oh, a filter might be good. People know what filters are. Essentially, it's where you change the EQ with a certain slope and you can move it so you can take out the bass or take it the high end. The technology originally was used for telephones. And so with telephones, as a voice is being transmitted, you don't need the entire frequency spectrum to be transmitted over a phone line. You just need what most voices are in. And so they trim out all this information in the highs and lows so it's more efficient. That's why cell phones sound so bad and like compressed, is they're so heavily filtered and you're like, and then I think they do a lot of audio compression as well and transferring the data. But even original telephone lines use filters to clean up the signal and make it lighter. So with a filter, you've got a frequency where you cut off. You can cut off the lows or the highs or both. And then you have, it's called resonance or Q, which is a quality factor. And do you want to boost the frequency at that cutoff? And this will make more sense when we actually look at it. In terms of, so with each effect, I'll talk about psychoacoustics a little bit of like, how does this effect impact the brain? When you use a low pass filter, which we'll hear, you can make things sound more like dreamy, underwater, muffled, or subdued. Whereas if you do a high pass filter and take out the bottoms, something can sound kind of airy, light, or far away. And we'll hear that. I'm going to experiment with putting it on the master track so you can hear it dramatically on all the sounds. And where the effects live is if you go over to the nav, it's under audio effects. And EQs and filters are together because they do very similar functions. They're very similar as technically. And I'm going to grab something called auto filter. It's kind of an older name in Ableton. Filter would have been just fine. But you can automate some of the filtering. But auto filter is the standard Ableton filter. So when I first drag it in, this line represents what is going to be allowed through. And so I can grab this handle and move it back and forth. And right now, no audio is playing, so we don't see what's going to be trimmed or what's being let through. But when I hit play, you will see the audio form of the entire track moving through here. Oh no, that's on EQ. So we can see the sound. We'll see it over here. EQ8 also can act as a filter. But to keep things simple, we're going to use filter. So I'm going to drag this down. You'll hear the sound change. This is a low pass filter, which means everything below is allowed to pass through. It can also be called a high cut filter, same thing. So you're cutting the highs or allowing the lows to go through. You know this sound, you hear it all the time in music and pop music. And so if I drag it all the way down, you can see on the right side, less and less is getting through, just the bass is getting through. And what I'm changing is the frequency of the cutoff. And so it feels like it's far away or underwater, or that you're outside the club. And some of the physics of that is that bass waves, lower frequencies that we can hear, they go at a slower frequency and they're larger. And those larger waves are able to pass through material in a way that higher, faster waves bounce off of material. So if there was like a big party on the street out here, the high ends, this part, wouldn't make it through the windows and the walls, but we would hear the bass. Because bass waves are big enough that they could slice through these walls and windows. That's why you hear bass outside the building, but you don't hear the highs, or like a door opening and closing. So this is like the doors opening. You've arrived at the party, you chat with someone at the door, and you realize you don't like this music, so you're gonna leave and then close the door. And you're like, bye-bye. And you walk down the hallway and it gets quieter and quieter. So I'm only moving a frequency knob, and you can create this whole narrative. That's where you get into sound design and creating stories. This is literally just one effect, just the filter. So it's open back up, and now I'm going to change the type of filter. So there's this little help window in Ableton, which is extremely useful. I think it's there all the time. I don't know if you can turn it on or off. Okay, so this arrow in the lower left is what allows you to hide and show this info view. I use it all the time. So if I don't know what a certain thing does, I roll over it and the explanation comes up. So down here in the filter, when I roll over these different line drawings, it's saying this is how I change my filter type. So that's how I go from cutting out the highs to cutting out the lows. So let's switch it. So now I'm going to keep the highs and I'm going to remove the lows. So we've got the full song. I'm going to open it all the way up. I'm going to start trimming out just the bottom. So DJs use this all the time in their sets. You know, the beat's going on and then they drop out the kick for a while. and they bring it back in. Everyone's like, how'd I get
Get that.
this window?
No, the filter.
Oh, I dragged auto filter from audio effects, EQ and effects down here.
I see different.
Oh, do you not have auto filter in maybe the trial?
I see on the back, yeah.
Oh, you're using Ableton 12.
Yeah.
Let me glance at it.
That's such noise. That's a good example. Yeah, it's indeed. It's almost like there's a bunch of tags at the top, and so you could find it there. Right?
So the question was, is where to find auto filter, and people on Zoom might experience this too. So if you've downloaded the trial is 12 and I'm using 11, and it's not quite this, you'll see like a group of tags at the top, and then auto filter will be just listed as one of the devices underneath. You can drag it to the master channel. Did that work? Yeah. Can you change the parameter over time? Totally. I will 30. I'll go through effects and then I'll show timeline type stuff. So the question was, is how do you change a filter effect over time, either in real time with a mouse or turning a knob? And that's in that timeline view, that session view. Essentially, I'm going to hit tab for a second. It's in this view that you can add keyframes and handles, just like in animation software. What's that? Yep. Yeah, I'll show that. I would say in the last half hour. I could show you how to do automations where either I will do it with my mouse in real time, or you can manually create keyframes. Let's get through effects first, but that's a great question. So switching to high pass. If you go really high, you really start to change it where it sounds tinny. Almost sounds like an old radio or like a telephone. So you start to get into different effects. So that's a filter. I'm going to delete filter and we'll jump into, let's try delay. I'm going to use the basic delay module. There's different ones. There's echo, there's grain delays, there's loopers. I usually use the basic delay. They're all great. So what is it? People know what delays are? Delays started with tape loops, where it would take the signal from the console, record it, and then have it play back a little bit quieter and a little delayed from the original. So it would create an echo. So if you hit a beat, it would be like boom, 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 boom. And they used to do that with physical tape loops that would loop around. And there's the Roland Space Echo is a famous, fun to use tape delay pedal. It's more of a box. It's quite large. And a lot of artists experiment with tape delays. So the beatniks were messing around with tape loops in, I think, the 60s in Paris. And then John Cage, a lot of people in the experimental music world would do things with tape loop machines at different distances. So with the tape loop, the distance of the reels from each other determines how long it takes for the echo to happen. So if they're closer, the echo happens faster. If they're physically further apart, takes longer for the echo to happen. And so the physicality of all those machines have been translated into these knobs and buttons that we have in here. I'm going to start with the delay. It might be too much to have on the master channel. So I'm going to solo Fool's Gold by hitting the S button. Click on Fool's Gold, and I'm going to drag a delay just onto the Fool's Gold track. See how this sounds. So the drum itself has quite a bit of like movement and repetition, but you'll be able to hear it when I take it away and bring it back. I'm going to turn up just slightly. With each effect, there's this knob called dry wet. Yes. The entire, yeah, the question is, do you drag the delay effect to just one clip on a column, or does it apply to the whole horizontal, vertical column? And it's the whole column, it's the whole track. So each effect, whether it's delay or reverb, has a dry and wet. So dry means original signal, and wet means only the effect. And usually they're at like 50%. So I'm going to play the drum loop just with the dry signal first, and then turn it up so you can hear the delay come in. Feedback is how long do the echoes last? Are they quite short, or do they last a long time? So this is dry. And now I'll start bringing in the wet, so you'll start to hear the effect. Just more snares, you hear more of a complexity. Original. So it's taking those snares and echoing them, so you get this more complex beat. Let's go back to our leather bass. It'll be easier here to echo. Yes.
Can you drag these effects onto a column? Is there a visual way to do that on the column?
Yes.
For example, I actually dragged it twice, so there's obviously a lead one.
So it's, how do you know that the effect is on that column? So when you can select different columns by clicking the top of them, and then you will see the signal chain. So as I drag it onto this column, you'll see it. I can also drag it down here. You'll see it added to the signal chain for that particular track.
Is there a delete button?
You can select that and hit delete. Yep. Okay, so fat leather bass, I'm gonna solo it, I'm gonna arm it. I'm gonna turn it up a little bit. So you hear the echoes. I'm gonna turn the feedback up so the echoes last a long time. Still going. Or I can make it real short. Just like 2 echoes, 3 echoes. So when you have something echo, you start to introduce a type of intoxicated or psychedelic effect. So, you think about what would be happening to a human brain where it starts to hear an echo. And so it starts to become this kind of trippier sound, rather than without it, just a beat. But you start to get into something that's a little more fantastical or dreamy. Let's turn the feedback up a little bit. So this bass line, which granted is a little bit harsh and like acidy and crispy, gets a little more dreamy as we add this echo. And that's really popular in like, delays started getting really popular in rock in like 60s and 70s and psychedelic rock. And so there's a psychedelic type of feel to delays. You can also change the speed of the echoes. And so by default, delay is synced to, again, Ableton's built for live performances and keeping everything quantized. So no matter what you toss on it, it sounds good. So the default for the delay is that it syncs up to the beat. And right now it plays after the beat division is 3, which sounds nice. So 2 is shorter. 1 is even shorter. It's a very tight delay. And when the delay gets really tight, it starts to become an oscillator in its own. It starts to have a consistent tone, particularly as you turn the feedback up. So this thing that did sound like kind of this gnarly bass starts to sound more like a string or a synth pad by creating that tight echo. Any questions about delay? I'm gonna jump to reverb. Yes, great question. Ping pong is each echo will go left, right, and you'll notice it more in headphones. And it creates more of a spatial effect. And again, that can create more of a sense of like fantasy or magic or psychedelia. Much prettier than my, let's take the delay off and go back to my computer music. Even with this is really basic. Let's add the delay. It's actually a little more palatable by putting the delay on it. You know, kind of smooths it out, makes it less harsh, a little more dreamy and more musical. All right. Yes, please. Question. Sure. So dry is the original signal. And wet is adding the effect in. So 50% means what we're hearing is 50% of the original instrument and 50% of the delay. If I go to 100, we actually won't hear the original instrument. We'll just hear the echoes. So I'll show you that. Totally dry. 50%. 100%. Can be hard to tell that because you still hear the instrument, but what we're hearing is I'll increase the delay speed to really long, and so you'll hear just the echoes more pronounced. So let's go back to dry. This is 50%. So I've lengthened the delay. And now we're just hearing the echoes and we're not hearing the original synth. It's not, it'll be a little clearer when we go to reverb. Yes. Let's see what it says. So it's a beat division and it says in our little info window. This sets the delay time of the corresponding channel in a beat division. Each numbered switch represents the delay time in 16th notes. So if it's on the 1, the question was, what do these numbers represent? And they're 16th notes. So 1 means it's going to be like every 16th note. 3 is 7 is . Ready for reverb? All right, the other thing you can do is you can mute and unmute tracks by hitting this yellow button here. So you don't have to delete it. So I'm just gonna mute it. Let's go to reverb and I'm gonna grab the basic reverb. And reverb, reverb is what happens when you're in a space. So there's even some reverb on my voice just as it's going through this microphone system and hitting the walls. It's just the natural bounce of a sound off of surfaces, and then it comes back to your ears. Reverb is really pronounced in places like cathedrals or churches where choirs are meant to sing, and they constructed it physically in a way for the vocals to hit the walls and then come back to the people. And it sounds bigger, it sounds nicer. And they started building reverbs for recording studios using these like sheets of metal or spring reverbs. They're again very physical things to create this reverberation, this oscillation in the sound that makes it sound like it's bouncing off the surface and coming back to. Someone who's cited quite a bit in ITP work, Pauline Oliveros. So she went into this underground cave type space, and it had a 45-second reverb. So you would like say something and then the reverb would be 45 seconds long. Just this massive, massive space. And when you start to get into reverb that heavy, you can't have a really dense signal that you're sending into it. You can just have a clap or a single piano sound, and that's going to fill up this space in a really beautiful way. So when you're using heavy reverb, you can really have simpler compositions. You don't have to add a bunch to it to fill up the sound, and we'll hear that. Yeah, reverb question.
Notice you dropped the reverb just there. Is it kind of assumed to be only applied to that? That's isolated.
Yep, because I dragged the reverb on the fat leather bass, we're only going to hear the reverb on the fat leather bass. If I dragged it to the master channel, it would apply to everything. Yep. And this is another example of wet and dry. So I'm going to start with dry with our computer music sample. Okay, we've got that. So I'm going to add reverb, and it's going to make it sound like it's in a room. I'm going to increase the decay, tweak some of these parameters a little bit. So same sound. Really changes the characteristic of the sound. So physically, reverb has to do with sound going to something and then traveling back. And our ears are always using reverb to determine what size of room am I in? How close am I to other people? How close am I to a wall or a surface? And a lot of work in psychoacoustics looks at how our brains are wired to survive, not in cities or, rooms or buildings, but most of our evolution happened when we're like running around in forests and the plains and different spaces outside. So if you hear a sound that sounds far away, for example, if I hear a growl of a bear or something, if there's no reverb, that means that bear is super close to me and I need to pay attention to it really fast. And so if something doesn't have reverb, it's in your face and like grabs your attention in a kind of abrupt way, similar to, it's not like a pleasant sound, it's just like it's in your face. But when you start to put reverb, your brain starts to think that is further away and you start to feel safer and you relax a little more. So you start to like drone out. That's why ambient music and drone music uses reverb, because it tells your brain it's okay to relax. You start to feel soothed. I know it's like nap time in the afternoon. Start making drones. Does the wet dry make more sense now? So this is 50%. You can hear the original sound, the clippy, and if I go to wet, it starts to remove the original sound and you're just hearing the reverbs. So it's just the refractions, it's just the reverberations. And the decay, that's something that changes the reverb the most. Makes it change. It feels like it changes the size of the room that you're in. So small room. And then bigger and bigger room. To the point where you get into these distances that are beyond physics. And so this is something that a physical reverb couldn't do, but in the digital world, we have a reverb time of 60 seconds. So that's even longer than that cave that Oliveros was in, which was 45 seconds. Yeah. Yes, so you can, the question was, what's this in filter on the reverb? It's exactly like the filter that we used earlier. It's gonna trim out part of the sound before it goes into the reverb effect. And the reason you might do that, a lot of times bass can get really muddy if you stretch it out over like 45 seconds or 60 seconds, and it just eats up and it just becomes too muddy. Other times, certain high tones are too resonant and sharp on the ear, and you might want to trim those. So you can apply these low cut and high cut filters to isolate what gets reverb. So let's mess with this. So I'm gonna put both high cut and low cut on and drag it way down so hardly anything gets through. Let's see what this sounds like. Now start moving it around. Let's do just the low. Now move it to the high. So you can bring that filter in and only have certain parts making it through the signal path. What's that? It doesn't alter the wet dry signal. It just alters the wet signal. Yeah, the dry signal. It's just the tail, the reverberation gets changed by the input filter. Yep. Any other questions about reverb? What's that? Like diffusion network? It's more about the output. And so input filter is changing what goes into the system. And the diffusion, it's similar. It's also a filter. It's what is put out. So let's do just wet. So I'm trimming the high or bringing the highs back in. So it's a filter on the output rather than the input. Whoa, what's this? So I turned the delay on, but I still have the reverb on. What's gonna happen? So you can stack effects. You don't have to use just one effect. And when you change the order, it changes the sound. So I'm just click and drag and I move the delay to be after the reverb now. It might sound similar. So if the delay is first, it takes original sound or obnoxious little computer music and echoes it. And then it goes through reverb, which stretches it out. In this sequence, it stretches it out and then tries to put an echo on those stretches. So it's just different effect based on the sequence. I'm gonna turn those off, and the last effect we're gonna do today is drive. So drive, it's also called distortion or gain or overdrive. And drive originally came from, actually goes back as far as the 30s, 1930s, where guitarists, particularly in rhythm and blues, they would play their guitar through their amp and push it until sometimes the amp would break. And so there'd be a tear in the cone. And so you wouldn't have this like clean guitar sound anymore, but you start to get this like fuzzy, like this distorted, crunchy sound. And it's because the amps were being damaged. They were being overblown or pushed to the breaking point. And so these musicians really like that sound because it created this like warmer, crunchier distortion sound rather than a clean guitar sound, where they started to intentionally physically damage their amps. They would go in, like cut the amps or damage the amplifier of the box in order to achieve that sound over and over. And then over time, the different companies started making digital overdrives, same effect acoustically, but it creates what it does is it pushes this signal until it maxes out digitally. So when we saw that red bar on Ableton, what that's doing to the audio signal is it's taking these normal like sine waves and all this audio information and pushing it to the peak where it flattens it out digitally. It creates these square waves, which creates this distortion sound. All this will make sense when we actually play it. So actually there's a bit of distortion already on there. So I'm gonna try to remove. That would be a good distortion sound. I'm gonna create a new MIDI track. And I might just use a pure sine tone. So operator has a basic starting sound. So that's just a simple default for a synth, just as simple as it gets. And then let's go to drive. So it's audio effects and it's under drive and color in Ableton 11. And I like pedal. It's a type of drive. And it has these 3 different kinds. It has overdrive, distort, and fuzz. I'm going to turn it down slightly. Okay, let's go up an octave. Use the gain. I'm turning the master channel down a little bit. I'm going to jump over to fuzz, which is the most aggressive one. The gain. Drop an octave. So you get this like beefier, more distorted sound. And then as you make the signal that goes into it more complex. So you get these like harsher, tenser sounds. And when you think about those original amps, the cones, when they would tear, they were torn because they had so much of a signal going through it, like too abrasive of a signal. And when we hear something that's distorted, there's this feeling of threat or danger to our eardrums, which is also a membrane that's being stressed. And so there's this correlation between those original amps being stressed, and you get this feeling of stimulation or stress because it's pushing your eardrums with this distorted sound. It can be pleasant. No, not everyone likes distortion, but as you, go to a noise, like a distortion noise show, and you've got like 15 very, very interested people, and it's not huge. Go to Taylor Swift, and it's like much cleaner sound, people like that. But if you learn to control distortion, which the heavy metal movement did really well with, particularly in the 80s, you guys, someone like Metallica really learned to control distortion, make it sound controlled and almost like symphonic. And it's not clean guitars. You're hearing very distorted guitars. See if we can mess with the sound. So you might end up with like a cool bass line. And what I like about this pedal effect is it's got this little button down here called sub. And this is something that took me a long time to learn. When you put something through distortion, you lose the bass. In that process of pushing out the waves and clipping it, you lose this really nice sub bass, so the body of a kick or the body of a bass line. And I used to do a lot of kicks and bass lines run through distortion, and all my old music doesn't have good sub because of that, because I was distorting everything and the bass would just get lopped off. What this little button down here does, the sub button, is it allows the original sub bass to pass through without being distorted and puts the distortion on top. Should be able to hear the difference. And then I'll add the sub. Just beefier. No sub. Sub. Yeah, record that. We added fool's gold. Fix the loop. Zoom in. Volume. Full scrolled up. Master volume up. It's a little unquantized, my distort baseline. So I'm gonna do control click. I'm flying through stuff a little bit here, but I'm gonna do quantize. Select quantize, quantize settings. Let's do it to 16. Why? There we go. So it's kind of a distorted baseline to go with our drum kick. On this, let's call this distort. So we've got pedal, and just because we have pedal doesn't mean we can't do the other things as well. So, doesn't work so well. Let's try the distortion after the reverb. It's kind of otherworldly sound. And then let's try delay on that kind of weird otherworldly sound. Weird sound. So it's just same original notes. You know, if you want to hear it without any effects, because effects really create different instruments. Let's hear just this. It's almost imperceivable. That's no effects. That's all effects. Kind of like a ghostly, weird sound. Yeah. Let's take a look. I think there's multiple notes. The question was, so I'm playing one note and it's jumping up to these other notes when they hit, and then it jumps back down because it's sustaining that one long note. So it's a way that you can create a whoa, 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 whoa sound. Let's move into session. Yes. Sure. Sure. So the question is, what is this sub button? I'm gonna turn the reverb and the delay off so we can just hear this. So when a signal gets maxed out and distorted to create that clipping sound, the crunchy sound, in the physical process of that getting pushed, it loses its bass. It loses its, I'll use a filter so you can hear it. EQ filter. So I've taken the filter down so just the low comes through. And it's pretty weak right now because when I run something through a distortion pedal, it loses the lowest frequencies, the bassiest, the boomiest sounds. And then when I hit the sub, you start to hear those like guttural sounds again. And it's just that bottom part usually gets removed through a distortion process. And that sub button, just with this particular module, adds that boomy space underneath. It adds it back in. So you still have a fuller sound and a distorted mid. Did that help?
Yes, when the term sub bass is thrown around, it's trying to capture that.
Exactly, yeah. So sub bass refers to, what would it be called sub? It's even subwoofer.
Yeah.
Sub means below, just thinking out loud. And a lot of times the frequencies that are pushed out through subwoofers start to cross over that line of what we can perceive or not. And so we, in our ears, can register to around about 20 hertz, which is, I mean, the size of that wave is so big, it's like from here to the other building. And so I'm wondering if sub means, you know, below the perceivable level because it starts to cross over. Certainly by 20, 25, 30, you're gonna be feeling bass as much as you're gonna be hearing it. And so if you're staying in front of a big sound system playing a drum kick or a bass line, like your body feels it because it's pushing, it's a physical force, it's a mechanical wave passing through the, it's a physical wave passing through the air, hitting your body. And that's what's enjoyable about big concerts is that you get to feel the bass on your body. All that range is described as sub. And so I'm guessing it has to do with, it's near that line of, it's below the, it's sub, it's below the level which we hear, which is 20 hertz. Okay, let's look at session view. So I've been avoiding this because it's easier to kind of get through a lot of those basics first. But I'm hitting tab. And if you're familiar with like Logic or GarageBand, if you jump over to this other view by hitting tab, it's more like those traditional or like video editors or animation, After Effects, Flash, or old school. You know, these are time-based, and this is how you create songs, is you take those loops that you've made in clip view and bring them over into, and stretch them out into a song, into this timeline view. So how do you do that? One way you could do it is copy and paste. So I'm clicking computer music, I'm copying, so edit, copy. I'm gonna hit tab, and I'm gonna go over to that same, so I'm in Fat Leather Bass. I can just paste them in. So if I wanted those, and you see they're super faded, and this is probably the most confusing part about Ableton is it playing musical information from the clip view, or is it playing musical information from the timeline view? How do you tell? And you can tell if it's faded out. So right now, this has the green arrow, it's highlighted. I'll solo it so we hear just it. No, that's our computer music. I'll add the reverb because it's nice. A little bit like, anyways. So this is active. This is playing because the green arrow. These are not active because they're dimmed out. So how do I get it active? To activate something once it's brought over to this timeline view, you can hit this play arrow here to activate just this track, or I can hit the orange one to activate all the tracks. And then if I go back to this, see how the green arrow is no longer lit up. So the clip isn't playing anymore because it's gonna play these clips. So if I start the playhead, just like GarageBand or anything, I'm putting the playhead in the beginning, we hit play. Nothing's playing until it gets to the musical sheet music here, which in the timeline. And then there's space. And then it'll play again once it gets to. So I can start to do arrangements that aren't just the loop over and over. Now, if I go back and hit play, it's going to shift the focus back to clip view. Again, this is the most confusing part of Ableton is these two different views. So clip view are loops, continuous loops, and that's where you do your sketching. That's where you get like the grooves that you're looking for. And once you find those, you drag them over to your timeline view and arrange a song. So let's do that. The other way you could, well, so this is the loop. The other thing you can do to get the information into this timeline, someone had asked earlier, what's this record button for? And this record button is for recording into the timeline. So if I hit record here, you'll see any track that's playing will start to populate my song. I'm gonna make sure everything's not muted because I want everything to play. I have no idea if this will be too busy, but let's try it. So I'm gonna hit record and see what happens. So only this is playing because that's the only thing that has a green arrow. So let's now add in the flute. So you see the flute just started coming in. And then I'm gonna add fool's gold. And then it's starting to come in here. So if I had a MIDI controller, I could do kind of jump back and forth between all the different sounds, and all my performance are going to be recorded into this timeline view. That's the techno view. So we have these bars now, and just like GarageBand, just like video editing, I can manipulate those bars to create my 1 minute song, which I'll do. So I want to activate these. You can see that they're dim, meaning if I hit play, it's going to just keep playing it from my clips. So I want to play from the timeline view, from the arrangement. So I'm going to activate all of these. So now when I play through this, activate this one too. I actually liked it when it was playing just every once in a while. So I'm going to copy and paste this like every 4. Here, here. You can copy and paste entire groups. And then you can just drag these handles and it's going to keep the loop. It's going to keep it on the grid. Let's have the beat kick in at the 5. Yes, switch the kick or switch the drums here. And bring in this kick here. So this just gets into song arrangement. You know, do you want to make a pop song? Do you want to make an experimental song? Do you want to make, and you had a question about automation, like how to change things over time. Yes. So the question is, if you have multiple clips in the same channel and you want delay just in one clip, right? Then, yeah, make a new track and have one with the delay and then bring the ones without the delay to the other track. So for example, let's say, is this what you mean? So if the leather bass, I wanted one with effects and one without effects. So what I would do is I would duplicate it. And then on the duplicate one, I would delete the effects. Was the question, how would I duplicate it? Yep, it would make a new. Like if I duplicate a track in clip view, it will also duplicate here. Or do you mean something like you change the wet dry over time? I can show you that and it could show how to bring effects in and out on a sound over time. Let's do that. So we've got, I'll just focus on the bass line again. And what I'm going to do is automate. Now that we're in timeline, we can start doing automations. So I'm going to automate, I'm going to bring the reverb, go from 0, max reverb, and then bring it out again. So I'm going to bring the reverb to 0. And the way that you can add automation, which is changes over time, I'm going to control click the thing that I want to change. And it says show automation. And so it jumps over to timeline view automatically because you can only do automations in timeline view. And then because I did the right click show automation on dry wet, these little red dotted lines are the automation. And so just like creating keyframes or handles, if I single click, I can then drag these up and down. And that's how we create automation over time. So I'll start dry. Still has the delay. And I'm going to click and drag these handles up towards make it more frequent so we can hear. So it starts dry. And then it's going to start ramping in the reverb based on this automation line. And that's max reverb. Let's copy another one and then bring it back down. Like that? Yeah. Keyframes. Yes. Let's do that with, so question is, can you, instead of doing keyframes, can turning the knob in real time as you're listening be recorded? I know you can do it with controller. Let's try it with the mouse pad, see if it works. So if, let's say I have those keyframes and I don't like them, I can delete the automation and I cleared it out. So I'm going to show it again. I'm going to hit record on, so I'm going to arm this track. See if this works or if it overwrites the notes. It's overwriting the notes. So is Alice here? Alice had a MIDI controller. So if I had a MIDI controller with me, those as I'm playing through a track, when I turn the knobs, it records that as well. But if I'm doing it with the keyboard, let me see if I'm playing live. So I'm not going to, I'm gonna try this. So I'm gonna play it live on my keyboard and try moving the dry wet with the mouse and see if that works. Create a new layer, same sound. I'm gonna delete all the sheet music so we can record the sheet music live. So you can see the notes are being recorded in as if I'm playing a live instrument. Let's try turning this. It didn't record that knob turn. Yeah, I know it works with MIDI controllers, but I don't know how to do it with just the mouse pad. Usually what I do is the handles. Have you used MIDI controllers? Okay, because it's a much more organic, like human sounding thing if you were able to turn the knobs and record those knobs. Yeah. But I definitely know it works with MIDI controllers. Any other questions about the masterpiece we're making? How do you show the automation? You pretty much can click anywhere on any sort of knob, right click it, and it's the top thing. It's show automation. And if you want to show the automation on the thing that you're tweaking, you click that knob. When you do that, you'll see this list appear. So for example, I did show automation on the reverb. You'll see a list of all the things that you can automate in this dropdown. So reverb is the effect, and these are all the different things I can automate inside a reverb. Essentially, it's all the knobs in the module. Yep, absolutely. So I could have one automation be the reverb, the dry wet of the reverb. I could have another one be the decay time. And I can create my own handles. There is a version where you can show all the automation in their own lanes. So you have show automation, or you can do show automation in new lane. So if I do that, this one's dry wet, and then this one, there will be a red dot next to it if it's been changed. So this way I've got my two different automations and I can see them simultaneously. It takes up more space, but it's easier to keep track of all the different things that are happening. So it's very similar to video editing software, once you get into this version of Ableton. And again, Ableton originally was made on those clips that are looping. This was meant for live performance, but over time they're like, well, how do we make songs? So they created this timeline view, which is very similar to Logic, Premiere, GarageBand. Anything else with composition? Feel like we've kind of covered a lot of the things that we want to. Is there any other general questions of things that you're curious about? Mm. Mm.
Is there a way to say, when you put a 4 out of 160, I think the B equals to 150 on 6 by 8?
Yes. I'm going to ignore that question and look at the Zoom chat for a second. Okay. So the question was, how do you play multiple time signatures at different tempos or different tempos? All right. Yes. I'll show you, but not in this file. So let's create a new file. And what I'll do is, and this will be using arrangement view more because the clips automatically want to quantize and warp things and keep it in the grid. Here's my samples. So I'll use, these samples are all different lengths, naturally. These drum samples. So let's do Apache. And let's do Hot Pants. Name of these drum loops are amazing. So I'm not going to use them in here. I'm going to paste them over into session view. So right away, you see they're different lengths. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn warp off, because warp is going to try to get it to fit on the grid. So I'm going to turn warp off on both of them. But because I've turned warp off, I can't loop them anymore. But I can copy and paste them. And I can turn off quantization on the grid because it's going to want to try to quantize it by doing Command 4. So I can really, it doesn't have to snap to the grid. So pop pants, jump to there. So these are not going to be in sync, which is the intention. And we'll see what it sounds like. These could be organic sounds, they could be drum sounds, they could be pianos. But the key thing is they're not warped and they're not looped. I'm just copying and pasting them. And this is how this non-warp view is similar to how a lot of electronic music producers started using software when laptops and different audio software became more available. They didn't have quantization. At first, they didn't have multiple tracks. And so they would just try to mash things up together and just copy and paste things repeatedly to make songs in the computer. And it led to some really creative things. And then they added multiple tracks, but nothing's quantized. And then you'd have weird samples and really experimental. I'm trying to remember, maybe SoundForge was an older. Do you remember SoundForge? I think anything that didn't have a sequencer. But it was early digital file copy and paste. And so that's what we're doing here. So let's listen to this. It might be atrocious. So they're on their own rhythm, they're on their own tempo, and you could do different time signatures. In terms of I would have to look up whether you can change the time signature of the overall piece. I don't know if you can change the time signature of an individual track. But I'm sure there's someone in this building knows. Or we could Google it or ChatGPT. Yes.
But if you say it's able to power one performance in terms of all of the lights, and
Yeah.
the smoke effects, where does that stuff plug in? So,
Ableton, there's a few different ways. The question was Ableton, using Ableton to power lights and effects and like visuals, or
you know, I would most concerts and Broadway shows.
are you thinking Touch Designer?
I don't know. I guess the question for you, what's in most live performance?
It can be a combination. So where the music is playing from here and then different commands are coming from Ableton over to Touch Designer, triggering, because Touch Designer can receive the MIDI that Ableton outputs. And so the same MIDI that's playing the notes of the instruments in here could be playing different types of bursts or effects or ripples in Touch Designer. Other thing you could do with Ableton, I've done this a bit recently, is I use a NTAC DMX box. So it's a USB that plugs in, and then a theater DMX cable plugs in on the other side. And then it's a string of theater lights like these over here, like the huge ones that are hanging. You can even see on the back of those, the 3 or 5 pin cable inputs. It looks like a microphone cable, but sometimes they're 5 pin. And DMX isn't too dissimilar from MIDI. It's a much older communication language for hardware. And so NTEC has this little plugin that loads into Ableton, which I can put automation similar to the red lines we just did, or I can put different types of notes or effects to change the parameters in the NTEC software. And so let's say every time the bass drum hits, it turns up my red. And so all the lights turn red just when the kick hits. And then it fades to either darkness or like a blue or a purple when the bass goes away. So there's different ways that you could use DMX, or I would say Touch Designer. And once you get into DMX, DMX doesn't just control lights, but you can also trigger smoke machines. They can receive a DMX signal on or off. So you could have a big bass note playing. So when everyone hears like, all the fog machines are firing from that same MIDI note. Yeah. And that in-text software is called EMU. EMU? EMU? Isn't that a bird? I don't know why they called it EMU, but I've started using that recently. You can also code DMX. Like, I'm completely backwards in a lot of my this type of equipment. I tend to build my own systems from scratch, totally illogically. And so I have iOS software that sends DMX packets to feed your lights. And it's frankly much easier to use the in-text box. Yeah. But Ableton can power a lot of it, or it can sync with it. The other cool thing with Ableton, if you're doing a jam with a bunch of people in the same room, is in the upper left corner, there's this thing called link. I don't know if it works on the NYU network because there's certain protocol blocks, but if you're on the same Wi-Fi, let's say we all jumped on the same hotspot, we could link all of our Abletons together. And so if I'm playing my beat, you're playing a piano, you're playing a bass line, you're playing a trumpet in Ableton, any of us can recommend a tempo change, and all of our tempos will change, and all of our beats will be in sync. So that's a really cool way to work with a bunch of people simultaneously, is Ableton Link. It's somewhat similar to MIDI sync, but it allows laptops to talk to each other and sync up. Yeah, it's very cool. It will also talk to like iOS software. So Ableton Link, you can have like a iPhone app that's a sequencer and have it be playing at the same time in the same position as Ableton. Okay, I know you've done quite a bit with performances and Touch Designer. Would you use Ableton in yours, or what was the music there? Okay. Because you can play sound from Touch Designer as well. I don't know Touch Designer as well. Got it. Sense. Yep. Any other questions? Got me 8 more minutes, and I'm happy to stick around. Yes.
Like files, like can we create an example and then example whatever, and then we add it to your library.
Definitely. So it's there all the time, or in one particular file?
Like on the samples, for example, for a drum break and.
Yeah. So there's a user library. And so I could create my own, for example, in my user library. So the question was, can you bring in your own samples? In the user library, I create my own folder, which are the old school drum hits from that drum machine that I used to use in the 90s. So I like having access to those sounds in Ableton. And I just drag them into my user library, which is down here under places. Yeah, so that could be your, let's say there's a certain vocal you used all the time, or a certain drum loop. If it's just for that project, I can record directly into Ableton. So let's say I'm singing and I can use the microphone on the computer. I can sing directly into an audio track, or if I've got guitar or bass or drums or whatever, as long as it's mic'd and the signal can get into the computer, Ableton can record live music. I'll show you. If you go to settings, to that audio, it'd be an audio input. So you can choose. So for example, I could use the microphone in my laptop, but it's better to use like an audio USB device and then plugging mics into that, or like a mixer, and then miking myself or miking a guitar. Or if you have external keyboards, plugging it directly into that keyboard and playing. So I could record that audio directly into Ableton. Into it, and it could be, I could loop it, or I could do it in this timeline view, either one. Yeah. Okay. Please.
But how long? would you say
Uh-huh.
what am I looking at?
How much time?
Yeah.
Take my class in the fall and you'll be a pro in 14 weeks. 14 weeks, you'll be a pro. Probably less than that.
Do
Cool.
you have like a, like this?
No, I'm teaching at NYU in the fall, intermediate Ableton class. So I taught a beginner's one this spring. And people with no Ableton experience made very robust. And the thing is, very young students were able to make excellent tracks in Ableton. Ableton reminds me at this point a little bit of Photoshop. There's like 5,000 things you could do, and you only need like 10% of it to make the thing that you like. And so that's been my goal with particularly the classes over at Collaborative Arts is how do I figure out what these students need to make the sound that they want? You know, so some people just got into sound design where they bring in field recordings and put heavy effects on them, and that sounded really cool. Other people wanted to make pop music, you know, so it's depending on the need. So depending on your need, I think it wouldn't take long, particularly you're familiar with other types of creative software. Yeah. I'm doing the same thing with Touch Designer right now. Like I signed up for an online class and I've gone to like none of them. And I just have been waiting for like, I mean, it's like 36 hours of content. You know, it's like these 3-hour classes in Touch Designer. I shouldn't say none. I've been to like 2.5. But I just got to make my way through those videos before fall. Yeah. Yeah, please. Can you show me? The question was about interfaces. If there's a little green dot on, show you on. What's the name of that pack that you're using? Drum effects? It'd be as if there's a little green circle here, right? Yeah, I think it means that there's a macro that is being applied to it. Yeah, no, you throw everything on there and see what happens. Well, I just want to say thank you everyone for their time and interest in this today. Yeah. Thank you. Great questions. Very good questions. I'll show you my contact info. Reach out to me if you have more questions come up. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those tools that once you get into it, you can really do anything acoustically. Basement's good. Yeah. The other clubs, nowadays is good. Nowadays is good. Physical therapy at nowadays, I think does a monthly or bi-monthly. That's a DJ name, Physical Therapy. That's fantastic. Very good sound system nowadays. Basement, also a very good sound system. It's like Berlin Light. I flew in from Berlin last night, so I'm a little jet lagged. I got like 11 last night. If you're looking for clubs in Berlin, I would recommend, obviously Berghain has an excellent sound system. It can be quite hard to get in. There's different tips of like getting through the door person. You've never had a problem, then I'm going with you then. So one of the tips is go with someone who always gets in. I've gotten in if I'm with the right company. I've been rejected 3, 4 times, 3.5. Yeah. What, it's a little hard to hear. What was I wearing when I got rejected? Oh, when I got in. Low key, I think I got rejected because I was wearing this bomber jacket that made me look like I was coming from the UK. And they try to filter out like US, UK people. And I just kind of had this like UK bro vibe. Everything else was right. I was wearing these boots that were like 8 years old and completely trashed, like completely trashed combat boots. Black like cargo pants or like military pants, black shirt. But I think it was the kind of this bomber jacket, this black bomber jacket. Times I've gotten in, I mean, all black clothes, black boots, black shirt, black coat. But it's really who I was with. I think that's the key. Yeah. Yeah. RSO is easier to get in and just to go to the sound system. RSO is like, I took a friend, just gonna tell Berlin stories for the rest of the time. Everyone on Zoom, feel free to stick around if you want to hear things about Berlin. A friend was visiting Berlin for his very first time from San Diego. He wanted to see what a Berlin club experience was like. And I was like, I think I know where to take you. So I took him to the Gegen party at RSO. Gegen is a monthly that happens. Gegen's great. It's run by Italians, so it's much more warmer than when the Germans throw a party. And you're in this like huge room. It's got the red lights, it's dark, massive sound system, very clean. And it's just a sea of people facing the DJ moving. It's just what you picture when you think of like a huge club. And it's a form of worship. Like everyone is there for like bass therapy. Like they need bass to like do their reset and like go back to their job for the rest of the week. You know, it's like, and it's like Sunday, 5 p.m. Like these are like 3-day parties. They're insane. Which is nice because like I don't have to be up at 4 a.m. I can go, like I literally went to 2 shows there at like 5 p.m. recently. And I was like home early. It was great. But when you're in there, you forget that the sun is out. And it's just this like beautiful room, amazing sound. And anyways, my friend from San Diego, that's exactly what I was looking for. And then different clubs have different level of like dress code, fetish gear, not fetish gear. You know, sometimes they'll have like costume or themes or whatever. Much more so than New York tends to. So, great questions, Kate. Thanks for being here. We'll go clubbing. Come over in January for the low-res session with Shimmy. Yes. All right, we'll do it. Awesome. We'll hit all the clubs. Make sure you're there the first Friday of January. You should be because the session starts like I think the day before the welcome. But we'll all go to Gegen. I'll guess on the skip queue list. Which is not a guest list. It just means you get to skip the queue, still pay, but you skip the lines, which can make a big difference if the line is 3 hours. Yeah, anyone who wants to come to the low res Berlin session. Just helping, just hanging out. That's what I did last year. Yes, you do need to go to, Alice was in the low res program the year before me, but they didn't go to Berlin because of COVID. Or Shanghai. Or New York. I'm gonna shut down the Zoom. Thank you, everyone. Stop share and leave.